Do I like do the like that just like you did? Like the way to beat? Welcome to Distilled Down. I'm Andy Rieger, joined today by co-founder Ryan Maybee. We're going to talk about history. Ryan, in terms of history, you started the craft cocktail scene in Kansas City, which nowadays isn't even a word people really get into too often. But back when you did it, it was a big deal. Arguably, it goes back to Prohibition, which later on you discovered something about before Prohibition. Walk us through Prohibition in Kansas City.
Yeah, so, with regard to the cocktail thing, I mean, craft cocktails, the art form of making really beautiful cocktails actually existed long before Prohibition, and it was Prohibition that killed it. But as far as like how Prohibition impacted Kansas City, the most interesting thing is that during the 14 years of Prohibition, Kansas City was the only major city in the U.S. that didn't have a single felony conviction for the sale and distribution of alcohol. We were considered a lawless, wide-open town, and it was during that time period in the 1920s that Kansas City gained the moniker Paris of the Plains because of how rowdy and fun it was.
It's because we were such an important city, right? That everyone just knew that we had to have alcohol in order to continue being as big as New York.
Well, to be fair, that's not far off. I mean, with regard to the jazz scene, like the nightlife scene, we were an important city. It's said that jazz was born in New Orleans but grew up in Kansas City, and it's because of that time period during Prohibition. Everyone sort of migrated to Kansas City to play music and to entertain and to have fun because it just happened. It just sort of flowed, and a lot of that had to do with the corrupt nature of Kansas City at the time, led by Tom Pendergast.
Corruption. So, ending Prohibition, everything that was in existence and everybody, what they knew before Prohibition, coming out of it, ended, altered completely. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, all the great bartenders, all the great classic cocktail books that were written prior to Prohibition with, documenting the way that bartenders held down the bar and practiced their profession. They all left. They all fled to places like Paris, London, Havana, Cuba, South America.
Both leading to Havana, Cuba
at the time. Yeah. And so the art form and the professionalism of the bartending craft disappeared after that.
So skipping briefly through some of your history, you came up, you discovered cocktails, you were using real fruit juices. Talk about, really just very briefly, your first real bartending gig.
My first real bartending gig was at Pierpont's at Union Station, and I consider myself really, really lucky and really fortunate to have had that experience. I was on the opening team back in 1999 when Union Station was the reopening and the revitalization of Union Station was a really big deal here in Kansas City. And Pierpont's was the flagship restaurant and bar. It's just beautiful. So being 21 years old and not having a lot of experience at the time, I'm really lucky that I was able to get a job there as an apprentice bartender, and it really kind of led me into this career path.
Even connected to the history that we'll talk about today, the opening of Pierpont's, the opening of Union Station, or the renovations of Union Station, led to the renaissance of the Crossroads District.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an accurate statement at the time. So I moved down here. I grew up north of the river, but I moved downtown when I got that job in 1999. And what we know today as the Crossroads in downtown Kansas City was an absolute ghost town back then. And I feel like that reopening of Union Station was kind of the spark that led to the resurgence of downtown Kansas City today.
So as part of that resurgence, a bunch of buildings are being renovated, a bunch of them are historical structures. Walk us through the history of the building you discovered in 2009.
So in my early 20s, early mid 20s, and falling in love with bartending, working at Pierpont's, and living down in that area. I would frequently bike around downtown Kansas City and walk around a lot, and I loved the grittiness of it. It was like I said, kind of like a ghost town, but there was something really beautiful about it, and I really loved the idea of seeing that come back to life. And I knew that I wanted to open up my own bar. I knew that I wanted to own a bar and restaurant. And while at the time it may have been, I I was definitely not advised to invest in that area. I still felt like I wanted to be a part of that resurgence. And so just kind of out of luck, looking around, found the old Rieger Hotel building at the corner of 20th and Main. This was back in 2008. And it just so happened that it worked out perfectly for me to open my bar in the basement of that building.
So 2008, you discover this basement in the Crossroads. It's the idea of the cocktail bar that you want to create, that Kansas City has never seen anything of the nature. Walk us through sort of the opening, the success, and really bringing people to a neighborhood that they otherwise thought was too dangerous to ever go to, and then what that led to.
Yeah, so opening Manifesto, we officially opened in April of 2009. I had been working on it for, about a year. I had been planning on opening it, and I had the concept and the idea for Manifesto like absolutely dialed in, every little detail in my mind. I knew exactly how I wanted it to look, feel, smell, everything about it. And it was definitely very, very different from any bar experience that anyone in Kansas City had up until that time. Everything about it was very unusual. And what's interesting about it also, the landlord of the guy who owned the Rieger Hotel at the time, the landlord thought I was crazy. I mean, he thought I was completely out of my mind with what I was trying to do, because we are in a neighborhood at the time where it doesn't have a lot of there's no foot traffic really. There's not much of a destination down there. So you've got to kind of go out of your way to try to get people there. Yet I wanted the entrance to be in the back of the building, in the alley, on the loading dock by the trash dumpsters, with no sign and a locked door.
That's brilliant marketing, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, I believe
everyone thought you were nuts.
No one thought it was a good idea except for me at the time, but I knew what I was trying to do, and what I really wanted to do was create a buzz around not just the experience at the bar or in the bar, but I wanted people to have an experience with Manifesto before they even got there. And that kind of ties into the whole way that people hear about it. I had these little tiny business cards made up that had no information on it except for a phone number. It had the letter M logo on one side and the phone number on the other side, and it said nothing else.
Texting reservations.
But there are not even any instructions like that, so it was very cryptic. And that created buzz and excitement, and I wanted people to feel like when they were first having that experience, like they were doing something wrong. Like, I did want them to feel like they're going to a speakeasy during the 1920s. I wanted them to feel that kind of anxiety in the pit of their stomach, and it worked, It worked, but really, it wouldn't have worked if once they got to the bar, we didn't deliver,
of course,
on the drinks and the hospitality and the rest of the experience.
So at that time, you put a bar in a basement of a building. You know that the building is on the National Registry as the historic Rieger Hotel. You have no real idea what that even means. You don't pay attention to it. There's a restaurant upstairs at the time. I'm skipping forward, but it was called 1924 Main.
Yeah.
And you're creating Manifesto. People start to love Manifesto. But at that same time, the restaurant upstairs isn't doing as well. Sort of walk us through what that era was like.
Yeah, so going into it, I like you said, I did know that it had previously been a hotel back, 100 years before, approximately. I didn't really know anything beyond that, didn't know anything about the name Rieger or anything like that. And the restaurant upstairs was definitely not doing well, and I knew that they were not going to make it long. I also felt like that first floor where the restaurant operated was really cool and had a great vibe to it. It had the original tile floor with this R logo in the floor. It had a lot of character, and I felt like it had a story to tell. I even said that to my chef and partner, Howard Hanna, later on. I'm like, this place has a story to tell. We need to figure out what that is. And so I didn't want to get too far ahead of myself. I wanted to make sure that Manifesto knocked it out of the park. Like, it's intimidating to open a small business, right? No matter how small it is. And I didn't have a lot of money to start it up. It was definitely bootstrapped. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose focus and get too far ahead of myself. So I had to make sure that Manifesto worked. once about a year in, Manifesto was crushing it. It was getting all kinds of hype. We had lines out the door 3 or 4 nights a week.
I mean, and like simply put, though, you were selling real cocktails. You weren't
selling really beautiful.
You weren't selling rum and cokes. You weren't selling. It was the first time people had really seen.
Yeah, and that's my
well put together cocktail.
Point that if it had just been the speakeasy concept, it could have easily been a gimmick or a novelty, and people come and experience it once, like, oh, okay, that's cool. But once they get in there and they have these cocktails, and it's so different, like every detail down to the glassware and the ice and the ingredients that go into it was just so dynamic and so rich and textured that it created this whole experience that just kept people coming back. And so it was very successful, a lot faster than I thought it would be. At the same time, the restaurant upstairs was quickly declining, and I knew that it wasn't going to last long. So about 1 year into Manifesto, 1924 Main shut down without any warning, and I immediately went to the owner and I was like, I want to take over the restaurant on the first floor. I have a pretty good idea about what I want to do with it. I know that I can make it work. I know this neighborhood's heading in the right direction. Let me have a go at it. And so that was really where the next step began. And I didn't have a real clear vision about the restaurant concept at the time, like I did with Manifesto originally, but I had some like general ideas about where I wanted to go with it.
So it ends up being empty upstairs.
Yeah.
You know this chef who is this up-and-coming rock star chef named Howard Hanna. What really convinced him to say, yeah, absolutely, this is a great space for me? Granted, the cocktail scene was this new thing still, but why did he want to take a chance? Well,
funny thing is, I actually didn't know Howard before that. He was a pretty well-known up-and-coming young chef at the time. He had worked for some really great reputable places in Kansas City, and he even traveled abroad and worked at some really awesome restaurants overseas and in New York. And it's really that's where we connected. Was he worked for about 6 months at my all-time favorite restaurant in New York, Union Square Cafe, owned by Danny Meyer. And I had so much respect for Danny Meyer at the time. I had read his book, Setting the Table, and I was very inspired by it. So that sort of ethos and mindset into the hospitality industry is where Howard and I really connected. So we were introduced by a mutual friend once it became known that I was going to take over the Rieger Hotel space. We were introduced, and the conversation went from there. We just hit it off based on his previous experience at Union Square and my admiration for Danny Meyer. So we had a lot of similarities in our goals with owning and running a restaurant.
So you and Howard, you're going to set out and do this restaurant. Upstairs, it's going to complement Manifesto in the basement, so the building already has a foundation. You know this building is historically known as the Rieger Hotel. You've talked about the insignias or the shields that are in the actual tile floor. That's this original tile floor. But one day, as you're designing this and trying to create this historical connection, you're outside. As part of your design process, you're just having a phone call. It was the most revelatory phone call you've arguably probably ever had, because you stepped outside for it and your eyes were wandering. So obviously you were not interested in the phone call. You're just like thinking about shit. You know, it's probably about like, you know, some attorney or something, and you're like, yeah. Then you're like, I gotta go.
Yeah, you know, you're on the right track. We were building out the space to limited, you know, we were building the new bar. We were making some changes in the kitchen. We were painting the walls and hanging new light fixtures. So pretty minimal build out. But we knew that we were going to call the restaurant the Rieger, or at the time we actually called it a more formal name, the Rieger Hotel, because I wanted to celebrate that identity. And like I said before, I wanted to tell that story.
This building that's on the National Registry of Historic Places.
Hotel, really cool story.
On the registry, it's called the Rieger Hotel.
Yeah, and so I'm outside one day while we're under construction, and I'm looking at the south wall from the parking lot, which I'd walked past, 100, 200 times, more than that. And I'm thinking about signage. I'm thinking about, okay, well, we're going to put up a sign for the restaurant. Like, where are we going to put it? How big is it going to be? What do I want it to look like? Is it going to be painted? Is it going to be, a box sign, whatever? And I'm looking at the south wall, and I don't know if the sun was just hitting it correctly or not at that time of day, but I could see there was this like faded image of what had been, however many decades ago, a painted mural on the side of the building. It was almost indecipherable, but I could make out what I was almost certain was the outline of a bottle. And next to it, I could make out what looked like a few letters like SKE. And I'm thinking, is there a whiskey advertisement on this building? Like, that would be really cool. Like, I wonder if I could find an old picture of the outside of the building and when this mural was, fresh, and restore it as part of the signage. Now, honestly, at the time, I'm thinking it was...
And whiskey's still not cool then. 2010.
Whiskey's always been cool.
Well, of course, to us, but
at the time, I'm honestly thinking, based on the age of the building and everything, I'm thinking probably a Seagram's ad or maybe Old Crow or something like that. I literally thought it was an old advertisement for something like that. But even if that had been the case, I'm like, I want to know, and maybe we could restore it. So I start digging around online for old pictures of the exterior of the Rieger Hotel from the south side, and there's a whole bunch of pictures from that time period from Union Station, right? Because Union Station opened in 1914, and there's all these really beautiful photos and postcards of Union Station, and a lot of them you can see in the background north going up Main Street. And I eventually stumbled onto one that was close enough and clear enough that I could make out what that ad was, what that mural was. And I looked at it. I had to do a double take. I'm like, wait a minute. And I looked closer, and it was a whiskey ad. It was a whiskey bottle, but it wasn't a brand I had ever heard of before. It said J. Rieger and Company Monogram Whiskey.
So I thought, though, that you Googled Rieger Hotel and Whiskey, or did you see the actual, you saw it say Rieger and Whiskey, and then you Googled it and discovered
the word Rieger
history.
was never, the word Rieger I never made out. All I could make out was a few letters of the word whiskey and the outline of a bottle. I could never make out anything that looked like Rieger as far as
But the picture showed it.
Yeah.
And
right.
so
the photo from back in like 1916 had a clear image of it.
And so when you saw that photo, then you Googled it.
Yeah, and then to find more, to try and, at that point, that was my first way of knowing that J. Rieger and Company whiskey ever existed. I had no idea prior to that. And so all of a sudden, now I'm connecting the dots, and I'm just like blown away by the idea that the company that built this hotel, this Rieger Hotel, also had a whiskey brand.
And that basic Google search opened Pandora's box.
Yeah, it led me to a website called prepro.com. And there was, it's like a collection of enthusiasts and collectors that collect old whiskey advertisements, ephemera, bottles, things like that.
It's a first generation website from like 1990,
it's old.
Right?
Yeah, it was an old website. But there was a one individual on there that had a ton of old J. Rieger stuff, and that's when I discovered just how big it was and how important it was to Kansas City's history, and I just became obsessed with learning more about it and also building it into the concept of the restaurant.
This whole plethora of this historical company known as J. Rieger Co. that more or less you discover as a part of it, you realize that this hotel is not the leading thing. This hotel was a secondary thing altogether. So walk us through the history of J. Rieger Co. that, of course, today and filming this, 15 years later, you know so much more about it, but just walk us through the actual history of the brand that then led to the hotel.
Well, that's a lot of history that actually, took years after that to learn all of it. And even honestly today, we're still learning things. But I think the most important thing was that I immediately realized just how much Rieger and J. Rieger and Company meant to Kansas City. That was the moment that really showed me that, knowing that finding out that J. Rieger and Company started back in 1887 in the West Bottoms when Kansas City was like really a boom town and becoming an important hub in the Midwest. Realizing then that it grew to become a national brand and become known as the largest mail order whiskey house in the United States, and we're shipping their bottles of whiskey across the country. And the more that I looked into it, the more that I became obsessive about learning more about the history of the brand and finding all these artifacts. I was finding old bottles across the country, everywhere. And so that was probably the most profound part of it, was realizing how much J. Rieger and Company meant to Kansas City historically prior to Prohibition.
So it was this brand started by immigrants. The Riegers, they came over in the 1870s, started this distillery in the West Bottoms in the 1880s. West Bottoms was so important because the original foundation of Kansas City, you had the East Bottoms, which when the city was developing really became the farmland to feed the rest of the city. The River Market, which was sort of the commerce area, and then the West Bottoms, which was this industrial area. Why did they start it in the West Bottoms in 1887? Granted, it was a distillery and it was industrial, but there was a few other factors in there that actually played.
I mean, I can only guess that it had the two main factors were Union Depot, opened in 1878 in the West Bottoms, and was the primary transportation hub in the Midwest.
The precursor to Union Station.
Precursor to Union Station. It was the primary, hub in the Midwest for anyone traveling westward, which at the time was very popular. But also, right along Genesee Street, where the original distillery was founded.
Spelled differently today than it was back in the old days.
That was actually the heart of what became known as the wettest block in the world, because with Kansas City being right on the state line, straddling both Kansas and Missouri, the state of Kansas went dry in 1881. They became the first state in the country to pass, statewide ban on alcohol.
Carry Nation.
Right.
Hatchets.
And so everyone on the Kansas side down there said, all right, well, let's go across the street, one block over. On the Missouri side, just blew up with anything alcohol related.
The modern day equivalent of weed or sports gambling.
Exactly. Yeah. So, that area where the distillery was founded on Genesee became known as the wettest block in the world. And so it was, casinos and saloons and brothels and a distillery. So that probably had a lot to do with Jacob's decision to start a whiskey company right there.
They make it a lot bigger by then really focusing around marketing, doing things that today are completely illegal, mailing liquor everywhere, offering free things, whatever that may be. The historical exhibit here, we've got all these tchotchkes that they used to send, from shoe shine brushes to bottle openers to shot glasses to coin purses. Cigars, true, yeah. How did they then get to a hotel?
Probably due to Union Station. So in 1914, when Kansas City outgrew Union Depot in the West Bottoms, and due to the flooding and all that, Union Station was built where it currently still is today. And Alexander Rieger, Jacob's son, had taken over the company by that point. And, by all accounts, he was a brilliant marketer. He could see the direction that Kansas City was going. And also at that time, leading up to that time period, if you traveled in the 1880s, 1890s, you were probably wealthy if you traveled by train. So trains were very, very fancy, and hotels across the country were very opulent and glamorous. He could see that it was becoming more widely accessible and available to all people. And so as that industry grew, there was a demand for what became known as the Traveler's Hotel, which was, usually it was kind of like the budget hotel of its day back then. And so you had like railroad workers and traveling salesmen and more blue collar demographics staying at those hotels. That was where he built the Rieger Hotel, right across the tracks from Union Station. And it was one of the first in the country known as a traveler's hotel.
And it was built fireproof.
It was, even one of the ads we've got over here says right on there, the only fireproof hotel in Kansas City.
So this hotel that they decide to construct, they're building it to coincide with Union Station's opening, the transition of the city. It's right along the original streetcar line on Main Street. Now that exists all over again. It was fireproof. But they always say that there was someone really infamous that would stay at the hotel that more or less continued to give it notoriety 100 years later. And that person was
Al Capone.
Al Capone.
Yeah.
So one of the coolest features before we get into, again, the initial opening night was, ever since the hotel started, those urinals had the infamous sign on them that was always stolen that said Al Capone pissed here.
Yeah.
Because they were the original mural or the original urinals.
I did. I had that sign installed above the. Yeah.
How many times did you have to install that sign on those original urinals?
At least a dozen times.
By install, I mean reinstall.
Yeah, I had to get really clever with some adhesive and screws and make it almost and yet people still managed to get it.
So fascinating history, fascinating people stayed there. 100 years later, you recognize that the hotel is not the primary business. The hotel was literally a marketing arm of this distillery that pre-existed. So with that, you decide to then make this restaurant, the Rieger, themed not just around the building, but really sharing that history. And you really wanted to create that historical exhibit, more or less, on the wall when you first entered.
Yeah.
Walk through sort of how you decided to go about finding things, building that wall, because that leads to everything.
Yeah, and it really was not even a decision. I mean, as soon as I discovered that J. Rieger and Company existed, it was just an automatic, now I know what I have to do. Now I know what this means and why it's important. And so two things happened. One, I began collecting as many old artifacts as possible, photos, bottles, those tchotchkes that you mentioned, the shot glasses, that type of stuff, and incorporated that into the look of the space when you first entered. So when you walked into the bar area on the wall, there were a bunch of images of our old advertisements, things like that, and then also restored the mural. So I had the hand-painted mural on the outside of the building restored to its original look, advertising J. Rieger and Company monogram whiskey.
So we're going to set the record straight then. Opening night comes around.
Yeah.
Sorry, prior to opening night. Let's make sure we tell the whole story. People start reaching out to you.
Yes.
Those people have a familiar last name. Walk through a few of those interactions.
The last name Rieger, the name Rieger, I never really meant anything to me before that. I didn't realize it was that common. But as soon as word got out that we were opening this restaurant, the Rieger Hotel, and we were telling the story, we got some press from it. I did get a couple people with last name Rieger reaching out. I had one person in particular call me one day with a sort of threatening tone, more or less. Didn't like the
Not
fact.
related.
Right.
Not related.
Not really too hip to the idea of me calling my restaurant the Rieger. And so I didn't really take that very seriously. And I hung up on him, and that was the last I heard from that fella until opening night. I thought maybe.
No, it was not opening night. or setting the record straight.
It was the night after the soft opening.
So the night after the soft opening, I showed up, I introduced myself, and you looked at me as if I wanted those free appetizers that person on the phone.
I wasn't sure. I didn't
was saying that they wanted.
Obviously we were really busy. It was our first night open to the public, and it was really, it was crazy. It was exciting, and I've, got a whole lot going on. And you walk in the door, and you.
I'm gonna go ahead and tell the story from this point forward.
You introduced yourself, and I didn't know if you were out.
No, because this part's my story because you always tell it much more bluntly or much more basically. So I walked in, and I introduced myself, and right off the bat, you are cold-shouldered, and I have no idea why. We just talked about why.
Yeah.
Having a wonderful, awesome dinner. Did not go to Manifesto, so I did not see it that night. Had never seen it. I was living in Dallas at the time, working for an investment bank, so born and raised here, but was just back visiting my mom for the holidays. And I noticed your wall.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed how many things you have missing that don't complete the story to where people can clearly understand it. And even though you were cold, which again, I was like, it's opening night, he's probably busy. I come back a few nights later, and I stayed up that first night, I'll never forget, and I made photocopies of dozens of things that I thought if you framed them and put them on the wall, it would help you complete the story that you were trying to tell. And I came back that second time a few nights later, and I handed you that envelope, And then you gave me the free appetizers.
Then I'm like, let's have a drink.
Yes. So from that point, we had another wonderful dinner, gave you the manila folder, and then that was my first night that I went down to Manifesto. I will never forget the bar stool that I sat in.
Yep.
You had the bar, you had
It was seat number 7.
seat number, whatever that means. It was right against the wall. So I was leaning against the wall with my back.
That would have been seat number 8, actually.
Okay. It was seat number 8 then. And then from there, you came down at one point when I was having my first drink, and you said to me, so you obviously know all about J. Rieger Co. from your childhood. We should bring it back.
I did say that, yes.
And I looked at you as if you were totally psychotic and nuts. And as I started thinking about what to say, you looked at me and go, I'll be right back. And then you didn't come back the rest of the night.
I don't know. I got distracted, yeah.
And that created the aura of what the hell could this possibly be someday into the future of planting that initial seed.
Yeah. The only thing what I remember the most was not the envelope as much. I know that there were some pieces in there. What I remember most was you bringing me the framed photo of Ellie. I thought that
That's in our tasting room.
correct. That's in our tasting room. But for the next 10 years, it hung on the wall there at the Rieger in the bar.
Ellie was...
Your great-grandmother?
No, she was my grandmother. She was married to Jacob's great-grandson.
Yeah. So
it was a photo of her on her wedding day.
It was her wedding photo. It was Ellie Rieger's wedding photo. And that I remember, that's what I remember from that interaction, more so than the envelope with the old J. Rieger Company stuff, because the sentimentality of it, really drove the point home of what the name Rieger meant to you, and how it just sort of humanized the whole experience for me, that this wasn't just a brand. It wasn't just a name carved into the front of this building or painted on the side. There's a family behind it, and there's a lineage behind it. And that's what I thought was really special about that moment. And I always loved having that picture hang on the wall there. And now today, obviously, yeah, it hangs in our tasting room.
And that's how we started everything, really. That's the beginning of the conversation of the revival story.
That was it.
This has been the first episode of Distilled Down. If you had a good time with us, hit the like button, subscribe to the page. We're going to be bringing you a lot more of this cool stuff. I'm Andy Rieger.
I'm Ryan Maybee.
We'll see you next time.